Okay. Hi, everybody out there. I know you're in listen-only mode, but I hope that we'll be able to chat sometime later on this afternoon. Thanks for joining us. We're going to be talking about surveillance and CNS trials with our title, Do You Ever Feel as Though You're Being Watched? My name is Dr. Christian Jaworski. I work for CROnos CCS. We do data monitoring. And I'm joined by the president of CROnos, Dr. DiClemente, and the vice president of ProPhase. ProPhase does rater training for a range of psychometric instruments. And Dr. Jovic, do you want to say just a word or two about ProPhase?
Sure, thanks, Christian. We often work together with CROnos to provide rater training and ongoing training during the course of a clinical trial, and we work together to synthesize some of the information that we get from psychometric data monitoring to really target the training. And I think some of the listeners are probably familiar with ProPhase, but we do it on a wide variety of psychometric measures, but all in psychiatry.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Jovic. And Dr. DiClemente, do you want to say just one word about yourself before we get started? Because I know you're going to be chiming in as we go through the slides today.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. As Dr. Jaworski said, I'm Guillermo DiClemente. I'm the president of CROnos. What we do at CROnos is we are devoted of doing data monitoring from the clinical aspect, not as project management, but as making sure that the scores are consistent throughout the clinical trials. And what we're going to be presenting today is our approach to this kind of modality. Dr. Jaworski, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. And you know, as in the first slide, the subheading was the CROnos Clinical Data Monitoring System. And we thought about these slides today and thought, well, we don't want people to just have to sit through a commercial for our service, but rather kind of lay out what the basis of this approach is and discuss a range of other approaches to the same type of surveillance and what some of the science involved is. So in this first slide, we have the panopticon, which is this etching, I think, is from 1791. And the idea here came from a British philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, in 1785. And he wanted to kind of take the pain and suffering, really, out of prisons and set up this idea of the panopticon where all the prisoners would be viewed or viewable from a central guardhouse. Now, this sounds pretty sinister, and it's kind of a weird way to start out our presentation on surveillance, but I think it does have some applicability here. There's a lot of ways to surveil people, and they don't necessarily have to feel that they're in jail. So if we look at the next slide, now, Jeremy Bentham's idea here was to create a sense of a sentiment of invisible omniscience. Now, we really try not to do that, not only with the raters that we talk to, but certainly we're all clinicians, and some of us work with schizophrenic patients, and a sentiment of invisible omniscience is really the last thing that we want to create. I know Dr. Jovic works in New York with quite acute patients, and I'm sure she can attest that not really the sort of emotions that you want to convey. That said, this was the idea of the panopticon was to create this so that people knew that someone else was watching. And I say the British and the French here because Michel Foucault, who was a 20th century philosopher, talked about this being kind of the origins of sort of social control and that type of thing, and talked a lot about psychiatry as well as it relates to this concept. Now, these older ideas that Jeremy Bentham had and in the way that Foucault has it philosophically is that these are kind of restrictive, kinds of sinister, almost, applications. But there are modern configurations. You only have to think about the nurse's station in hospitals. It's set up centrally so that one nurse can see a lot of people at the same time. And in that way, we kind of have an uneven metaphor for the work that we do in clinical surveillance, and importantly, to remain vigilant clinically, is we have a central location where all the scores come into us. We look at them and then determine who needs to be contacted so that we retain good rater reliability and validity. Gishe, do you want to say anything more just about these points? We're going to get into more of the specifics as we move through the slides.
No, what I would like to propose is while we keep discussing this topic is to go to the first set of polling questions that we have, so we allow the audience to have time to answer those questions while we keep talking about this topic, if that is okay with you.
Okay, that's fine. So without going too far ahead of myself in the slides, this idea of clinical surveillance has been around for a while, and even some of the very, very early practitioners recognized the need for not only maintaining this idea of inter-rater reliability, but that this was critical to maintain power within a study, and certainly it has impact on sample size. We brought up the idea of clinical vigilance here too, is that it's not only important for the raters in the sites to be vigilant for adverse clinical events, but also in terms of the quality of the measurements themselves. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. Sophia, if you could say a word here about rater training and how that impacts reliability. I'm thinking here of our most recent investigator meetings overseas in Singapore, and that we really try to get everybody on the same page reliability-wise.
Right, and I think something that came to mind as you were talking about surveillance, and I think it's a similar point to be made about reliability. So surveillance is not something that's done for its own sake. It's done to produce a result, and that's quality data. In the same way, reliability is not a goal or sort of an end in itself. It's a means to get to data that's valid. So in that respect, sometimes it's easy to forget that, or to sort of think of means as actually the end. And certainly in our training, we try to have as much of a genuine discussion about the complexity of the clinical picture as possible. And sometimes, the data points can be simplified and the information can be lost. And it's very important to retain that complexity, and that starts with the training. So while reliability is important, obviously, in a multi-site study, it's also very important to give clinicians or raters the tools to capture the full complexity of the picture that they're seeing, because that's really where the richness comes from. And then we hope that translates in the way that surveillance is done, so that very important complexity of information is not lost as it's being monitored.
And I think that's a critical point that we do try to bring up in training with the prophase group is not only getting people on the same page in terms of everyone doing it the same way so that we have good reliability, but getting at this issue of uncovering the complexity and really understanding item by item how the symptoms are being measured to get at validity. And I think that's a really crucial point. What has happened over time is that we have kind of not trusted sites and clinicians quite as much as we did initially. I think it's interesting to remember that structured interview guides are a relatively new creation. It was kind of just up to the clinician to use a standard clinical interview to obtain the information to rate the MADRS or the HAM-D or the YMRS or the PANS or whatever it might have been. So sponsors now, there's a little bit of a contradiction sometimes in the messages to the sites. You are the clinician, but you need to also go to this rater training, and we also might need to record some of your interviews, and this is your patient, but we'd really like you to do it this way. And sometimes I think clinicians are rightly either a little irritated or sometimes a bit confused by this. I know, Gisha, you've had a lot of experience with sites and these issues. I was wondering if you could just say a couple words about this particular issue.
Well, I think that what we are talking about here is to manage to find that a balance between respecting the good sites and trying to improve those sites that are having problems. I think it's very clear that there are several components going around, and there are very good raters, and there are raters that are not good. But I think that what we see is this, when we're talking about this contradiction, is this problem with pharma. There is either trusting sites or not trusting sites, and I think that there's a middle point that we need to find here.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, thanks. Let's move on, and in this next slide, I think gets at kind of the heart of the issue. And when I have talked to sponsors in the past, and they often have a range of different products that they're developing, not just for CNS, but maybe for kidney related ailments or heart related ailments, whatever it might be. A lot of other trials use pretty objective measures, blood tests, fMRIs, whatever it may be. But in CNS, we really have to rely on these subjective accounts and using these standard instruments, the PANS, the negative scale here, the NSA-16, the HAM-D, the MADRS for depression, YMRS for bipolar disorder. And in using these, we've had over time problems with signal detection. And that's kind of been the result of these subjective measures. That said, the instruments themselves have been shown to be quite robust in terms of reliability and validity in the tightly controlled experiments that are done to test this. But in practice, we all know that there's rater drift, and we can train people and spend a day or two training folks, and they can have pretty good reliability. Usually at some of the prophase trainings, we get people right up to the 0.90 or higher for the interclass correlation coefficient, pretty high reliability. But over time, people fall back into perhaps their idiosyncratic way of rating or drift in other ways. And it's generally pretty well understood that if we improve reliability, this improves power. And since about the mid-90s, I think it was Mueller and Zaghetti that published a range of papers at that time that advocated for standardized rater training. But with this recognition, we know that this continues to be a source of variability in trials. So the question is here, what can we do about it? In the next slide, here are some of the things that we can do. So there are a number of companies that provide these types of services. Video capture, this is where either a camera or a computer is used in the room with the rater and the patient to capture the video. These are usually then sent off to another point to be reviewed by an expert, and then the expert and site rater scores are compared. Sometimes the expert scores have precedence. Sometimes there's a consensus call. It depends on the method. Of course, there's centralized rating, where raters are located at a central point and communicate through a complex array of video VTC technologies with individual hospitals around the country. And so patients sit in a room with a camera and a screen and are asked questions by a rater at a remote location, and the rater scores the instruments. There's consensus rating, which is interesting. It's a bit of a blend of the video capture and, believe it or not, some of the original conceptualizations of psychometric instruments were recommended to be done by two people, and consensus ratings done afterwards. Max Hamilton thought that this was the best, most reliable way to do the hand-D. We have some problems with that. It's not the most efficient thing, and it can be a bit expensive. Less problematic is just random rater evaluation, where the sponsor picks scores or picks assessment instruments at random, reviews them. If there are problems uncovered, a rater is contacted, and a discussion is had. And then finally, what we do, data monitoring, which I'll describe in some further detail later, but it essentially involves leaving the sites alone to do their own rating. They submit their scores to the sponsor as usual. The sponsor gives them to us. We run them through a set of algorithms that look for any logical inconsistencies with the instruments, either binary or factorial, and then we contact the rater as necessary to have a conversation about the visit. All right, next slide. So some of the approaches to reliability and validity within a trial, and this is really what we're trying to get at through whatever means of surveillance that we choose, whether it's video capture, consensus rating, data monitoring. But there's a couple ways that it's been done in the past, either leaving the sites alone completely, a sort of laissez-faire method. I think we needed a hyphen in laissez-faire. I think it's a hyphenated word. Is that right, Sophia or Guichet, do you know? I think it is. Anyway, or more intrusive systems. And these are based on some ideas that site raters just aren't that good. Either they can't rate properly, or the ratings are unreliable or biased. And I'm sure a lot of people on the phone today have heard that about site raters, that placebo effect is exacerbated by therapeutic alliances that are formed with site raters. And certainly this can happen. Guichet, do you want to say anything about that?
No,
Okay.
again, I think that, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I'm again, I think that what we're trying to convey here is this concept. You know, we're presenting all the different systems of surveillance that they are around, and we believe that all of them have some advantages and also some shortfalls, and somehow they all present limitations. But what we are advocating here, the message that we want to convey is that there's a balance between what to do and what to avoid.
Absolutely. And I think in our next slide here we address that there's one of kind of two ways to look at this to manage this reliability and validity issue. And in one sense, we set up this false dichotomy of trusting sites and being self-policing, and that can't quite happen all the time, and then taking all the power away from sites and alienating them. And as Dr. DiClemente was mentioning, both cases are kind of extreme and don't often have good results. I've heard, we were at a conference recently, and one of the speakers likened the centralized rating to taking away sites' liquor license, kind of relating it to a restaurant, and that if sites couldn't do the rating themselves, they weren't, it didn't make it economically worthwhile for them. Let's move on. So again, some of the misconceptions that site raters are bad, they only care about recruitment, that the rater always needs to be blinded to the protocol, and that independent blinded raters can more accurately detect placebo responders. And I've heard a lot of arguments for and against this last point. And I think it was just yesterday, as a matter of fact, we were talking with a sponsor, and they were saying, well, if it's a placebo responder, why would it matter? Because they'd be giving you the same information without conscious awareness that they were responding to the placebo. I thought that was an interesting argument. Dr. Jovic, do you want to say anything about this idea that site raters are bad clinicians? I know you've done rater training events really all over the world, and I'm sure you can attest that there could be a couple bad ones, but in general, how do you find folks?
Well, actually, it's interesting that you mentioned the global work that we have done, because obviously the profile of the average rater or site person varies from country to country, but something that is definitely, I would say, the rule rather than the exception, and it's maybe becoming a little bit of an exception in the U.S., is that these raters are actually usually very well, they're associated with the academic sites, and in the U.S. now with commercial sites, you have people who are very well credentialed and who have done exceptional work and remain in the academia, and internationally it's more often the case that these people actually still continue to hold academic assignments and posts and so on. So I think it's a misconception to say that just because someone may not have a purely clinical practice, they may not be a good rater. And we have, in fact, discussed internally that, you know, being a clinician is very different from being a research clinician, and that those are different skills, and that, in fact, being actively involved with patients as a clinician may interfere with your ability to be an objective rater who is not imputing symptoms and so on. So it's a discrete set of skills, and we do think of it as a study-long process, and certainly we have now worked with a number of raters who we affectionately refer to as repeat offenders, but or usual suspects, who come up in a number of studies. And so our relationship with a lot of these sites and raters is really a multi-year ongoing relationship. So really the education effort on our end continues well beyond the initial meeting, because what we're talking about is really a discrete set of research skills, including but certainly not limited to accurate and proper interviewing fully following up the questions and so on. So I think it is a different skill set, and so just because someone is a very experienced rater in a clinical trial, it is actually a positive in my view. Someone who's very experienced clinically but has not been trained in the context of research may actually have a bigger hurdle to overcome in terms of unlearning some of the more quote-unquote clinical approaches to interviewing, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point, and that comes up quite often, especially in some of the instruments that have, for example, more rigid anchor points like the PANS, that although we want people to be good clinicians, we also want them to follow the rules. And sometimes being very, very good clinicians actually is not the best thing for getting reliable and valid data. I'm thinking here about a couple of the PANS items, G2 and G4, for example, where G2 is anxiety and G4 is tension, where good clinicians will always want to rate tension if they see it, but as per the PANS rules, we can only rate tension if there's a verbal report of anxiety. So the research clinician does a little bit better there. But yeah, excellent point. Let's move on to a couple of facts that we came up with these last week when we were talking about these slides in this presentation. Or what are the facts of the matter here with surveillance, with issues around sites and raters? And one is sort of what both Drs. DiClemente and Jovic have just mentioned, is that there's good and bad site raters, as there are good and bad centralized raters, good and bad independent reviewers, good and bad CRAs, ad infinitum. And I think that should be recognized. And part of the surveillance solution with data monitoring is recognizing those raters that aren't quite as good early on, providing remediation, and then keeping an eye on them for the rest of the study. All right, let's move on to some more facts here.
One point that I would like to make regarding this is, that there's no magic. All these solutions that propose, they all have problems, and within this fact, what we want to convey is you can see how many raters that at one point of their life were site raters. Now they do centralized ratings, or the other way around. I see in the audience people that they were at one point raters and now they're doing training. So this is a moving target, and I think that the takeaway of this is that it's something that we need to work together to improve what we have, but there's nothing that will solve the problems of clinical trials as they are right now. To do surveillance and basically having a person who before used to be site rater and now he will be doing surveillance, that's just showing you that we have a problem, that it's not just as simple as
right. Right. We need what you're saying is we need some good biomarkers. Okay. All right. Another one of the facts that we thought of this matter is that in our experience, most of the sites really do care about the patient's well-being, and they do try to recruit the best and most appropriate patients. Recently we were down at the CNS Summit in Florida, and one of the things that came up there pretty often as a concern with sponsors is recruiting the right patients, making sure that not only it was the appropriate diagnosis, but the right severity level to gain entry into the study itself. And I think it is an issue, but I do think that most sites are operating in good faith, and they do try to do their best in terms of recruitment. Next slide, please. And this was something that Dr. DiClemente and I have talked about for a while and kind of gone back and forth on. But even if you have a blinded rater, They can be also tempted to get into the guessing game about who's on what medication, especially when you think about some of the antipsychotics that have side effects that might include weight gain. It's going to be fairly apparent to raters. And a lot of raters that I talk to they can usually tell. I don't think it's any sort of conscious thing, but they've been doing it for a while. Maybe it's intuitive. But those of you who've worked at sites before or have worked in clinical trials up close and personal with patients, there are some patients that you can tell. So being blinded to the protocol or whatever the entry criteria might be is not necessarily a guarantee. So I will not go on with any more facts beyond this. There's not really much data from sponsors or any of the third parties that we've dealt with that support the idea that centralized raters, for example, are better than site raters. And we know that some of the centralized raters were once site raters, which could imply that the difference is more related to training than to the effect of centralization. Some of the issues that we've come across, again, this idea of the liquor license, sites sometimes feel a bit alienated by the centralization process. They sometimes feel a bit alienated by video review. I don't know here if alienation, I don't know if we use the right word here. I think perhaps the better word is maybe threatened. It's not nice if you've taken the time to go to medical school and do your psychiatric residency and participate in a number of trials for the someone to come in and set up some cameras in your office and imply that you might not be doing it right. And this sets up, again, this contradiction that we mentioned before. We want you to recruit these patients. We trust you, but we're going to put a camera here also. There are other ways, I think. Yes?
Now, also one of the issues, for example, with your video review, issues that we come across on a daily basis is a problem of the temporary space problem. You have a reviewer that sometimes is strict regarding the review, and they say, well, I cannot rate that item. It's not covered the way that it's supposed to be covered. You cannot go back and do the interview again. So then sponsors don't know what to do with that data. Do we go with the reviewer? Do we go with the rater? So this is part of what it alienates raters about. And if you take a closer look, then you discover that you're not only talking about the clinical knowledge of the rater itself in terms, for example, I don't know if you're talking about hallucination and detecting what a hallucination is, but in the way they are going to be collecting that information in order to rate an item. And so then you have in a second layer of problems how they're conducting the interview, and then how they arrive into the best possible score.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so if I could have your help here, Dr. DiClemente, in discussing this, I think with the CROnos system, we try to take a collegial, non-confrontational, obviously, approach to raters, remediate poor technique. Poor technique, let me just define that real quick. So all the scores go through these algorithms that, as I mentioned earlier, are either binary or factorial. And if we come across inconsistencies, we talk to raters about that. And when I say remediate poor technique, what this is referring to is if someone tells us that, well, I only asked about how they were doing yesterday, rather than over the past 7 days, which is usually the indication for a lot of these scales, we would kind of refer them back to the basis for doing the instrument. Keep in mind that it's over the past 7 days, or keep in mind that we really need to understand the frequency of this symptom, not only the severity. Those types of things are remediation for technique. Another aspect to this is that it's a more systematic approach based on these algorithms and not on subjective metrics. For example, I know one of the scales that's often used is the Rater Applied Performance Scale, which, although I think it does have reasonable utility in terms of gauging a rater's performance, doesn't really help so much in terms of actually getting to the best, most reliable, most valid scores. Kisha, if you want to cover these last 2 points, I know that these are especially important for you.
Yes. So what we're talking about, a centralized, consistent message, what we're talking about is providing feedback to the raters in a consistent way. We come across, again, on a daily basis about raters that they receive conflicting information in different training sessions, that they were advised to round up scores. Sometimes they are not sure what is it that the item is actually trying to capture. And what we pay attention here is just to provide the same message to all the raters and try to put all the raters within the same page to keep them calibrated. And for the sponsors' point of view, we try to create this situational awareness where the sponsor knows what's going on, what kind of patients they're recruiting from the symptomatology point of view, what kind of raters are they getting, what are the problems that raters are having. Basically, we are going beyond scoring a video and checking on real life how they're doing, how they're managing to collect information, and how they manage to arrive to the best possible score. Again, as we were talking with other slides, this is just our approach. We believe that we are reaching a balance between not being intrusive with sites, not taking a lot of time away from the sites that are very busy. At the same time, we understand that we are not teaching raters. We are not going to teach them what a hallucination is, but what we're going to try to convey is what is the best possible score based on the information that they have.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what we are often asked when we're presenting this is basically, okay, smart guys, how does this work? So the rater at the site conducts the assessment as they usually would after they've been through rater training, submits the scores as they usually would to their EDC. Then we get the scores from the EDC for analysis, and that happens the same day. The computer-based algorithms that we have detect potential inconsistencies in the instruments. And like I mentioned a couple times before, these could be either logical inconsistencies or inconsistencies in a presentation given a particular diagnosis. So, for example, if we see someone in a trial for schizophrenia and we know it's they're recruiting for quite acute folks, and we see total PAN scores of in the mid-30s or so, or mid-40s, which is quite a bit less than Dr. DiClemente might score on a normal day. We know to tell the sponsor that this is probably not the type of patient that should be included in the trial due to significant floor effects. So I diverted a bit there. So if we've detected one of these potential inconsistencies, what happens then? Well, what we do is we'll call the rater on the phone and talk to them about the patient, about the presentation, and match that presentation to the scores that they've submitted. So what do we do with that? We provide remediation if it's incorrect, or feed that information back to the sponsor to let them know in real time how the trial is going on the ground. Okay, so the algorithms, what are these things? Well, we've developed them with the scale authors. Dr. Luopler helped us with the development of the PANS algorithms. Stuart Montgomery helped us with the MADRS algorithms and so on. We obviously had a little trouble contacting Max Hamilton with the AMD. He's been dead for some time now. But we did refer back to the literature for the scale and really thought carefully about which factors loaded for which items in the development of these. And all of these have been validated using unblinded trial data. And I think this is a really critical step. I think that, you know, not to say that anybody could develop their own algorithms if given the right ingredients, but you do need a lot of trial data to make sure that these are measuring what you think they're measuring. False positives and false negatives, we do intentionally have some of these present in the algorithm. So if we do contact someone, sometimes they're right. In fact, a lot of the time they could be right. And it becomes more about making sure that everybody in the study is on the same page and doing these instruments in the way that they're intended to be administered. We could just look at the next slide. Often this is helpful in providing sort of a visual for what might happen. So if we look at this presentation, this was from a study a couple of years ago, and we look at the item P6, which is suspiciousness and persecution. So this is somebody at the level of 6 there that is pretty paranoid. They have some probably quite entrenched delusions that they're acting on. And if we then start to look around at the rest of the scores, we begin to see that a somewhat inconsistent picture emerges and that we'd like to talk to this rater. For example, the relationship there between that level of paranoia as a delusion and the actual score on delusion, P1. And we'd also expect that at this level of severity that the patient is acting on their paranoid delusions, that they're avoiding people and so on, that we might have an impact on N3 poor rapport or even G16, even though that item active social withdrawal is an informant-only item. We would expect there to be a little bit higher scores there. So that's the sort of chat that we'd probably have with the rater. So data quality, reliability and signal detection, what's the evidence base? Well, I mentioned Euler and Zaghetti earlier. The umlaut is missing from Mueller's name, but we know that there's a relationship between sample size and interclass correlation coefficient. We know that as the ICC goes up, sample size goes down with the power being held the same. If we maintain the sample size at the same thing and increase ICC, we get more statistical power. What that translates into is showing an effect where there is effect, or demonstrating that there is no effect where there is, in fact, no effect. This is a study that we did. I know we're running out of time here. I think looking at the impact of data monitoring that was implemented at a study midpoint on the PANS score consistency. If we move to the next slide real quick, the results suggested that there was a fairly large effect, that the difference before and after in the consistency that we saw in PAN scores was quite significant. We've presented this at a range of conferences. People have been pretty receptive to the idea, and the sponsor that we did this particular study for was quite happy. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about some of the strengths and limitations here. Some of the strengths of the this approach, the CROnos approach or data monitoring approach, is the site perception of supervision and collaboration and not a sort of antagonistic relationship. Reduction of rate or drift, enhancement of reliability. It's a well-validated method, and it's efficient in cost and in time. We could argue that those are the same thing, but is it the best? Well, ideally, would we like to record every single interview and review it through a panel of judges? Sure, but I don't really think that we have the resources to do that. And some of the limitations here is we don't capture and record assessment. It relies on the instrument and the rater's report of what occurred during the interview. And it maintains the autonomy of sites, which sometimes is quite good and other times has its drawbacks. All right. I'm seeing here on my screen that the organizer is saying that we can go a little over time if we need to because we started a little bit late. Okay, so we're going to open it up to these polling questions. I saw a question that came in earlier and it said, I might have missed some slides. Is there discussion about subject identity issues if using video? Now, I think what that is referring to is, I hope that the person will write back and tell me if I'm correct or not here. Subject identity issues, I'm assuming, is referring to confidentiality and what sorts of agreements might need to be in place to protect subjects and how that might be related to sort of compliance with FDA and NIH subject protection guidelines. But I'll wait for somebody, whoever asked that, I hope they're still here, to write back and let me know if that is indeed what the reference was. Dr. Jovich or Dr. Clemente, any opinions there? Do you think that's the issue?
I don't have the knowledge to go over that piece of information. I know that there are a couple of papers going around discussing this issue, and I think it's a big concern that has been raised, and I think it was overlooked in the past couple of years. But again, I'm not an expert in this topic.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think it would raise concerns, especially in light of recent leaks of information. How is that data encoded, protected, and stored? For what time periods? Who has access to it? If you're using external expert raters, how is that data transferred? How is it stored? And how is it protected? I think it is an issue. I don't think that it's insurmountable, but it is quite problematic.
I think, Christian, when you were silent there for a second, I was talking on mute, and my best thoughts are always expressed that way, but I think it's similar to, it's obviously there's personal information that can fully identify a patient, not just in video surveillance, but in other means as well. But I think it's an indication of how fast things have moved, and that perhaps there has not been as much collaboration with the sites and listening to their concerns as there could have been, because this is an area that has not been addressed. So I don't think that it's impossible to address it, and it's probably adequate to address it in the same way that other identifying information is being stored. But it's just a testament to how quickly things moved in the field, that this has not been addressed in the same way that other, for example, the electronic communication has been addressed and confidentiality of that. But video is particularly at issue, and certainly globally there's been much more pushback. I'm thinking of countries in Asia, specifically Japan. I'm thinking of the sort of pushback to video monitoring, and so then, or really any type of surveillance. So then the question becomes, what do we say to those sites that will alleviate their concerns? And also, are there any fallbacks so that these sites are not, that they're basically going through the same process, or at least similar as the other sites, because there is this issue of generalizability and having a uniform process across sites, across countries, and so on. And I haven't really seen addressed in literature this issue of having a study that does have, let's say, video surveillance, but it does not talk about what happens with sites and countries that refuse to participate in that.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. That comes up just to mention real quick the idea of these systems, surveillance systems with cameras. You also, especially with certain populations, schizophrenia, for example, I know that while some patients don't mind at all and it's not a problem to elicit information from them with a camera present, some choose just not to be part of the process, so I think it skews the data a little bit. I saw a clarification of the person that asked that question, and they said the interpretation is correct, and that that was really the concern, is that project subject identifier is for HIPAA compliance. And I'm not 100% familiar with the exact rule for HIPAA compliance, but I think it is probably a big concern. I don't know that there's current guidance, however, and that would certainly be something to check. Okay, other questions people can write in. Here's another question. Would data monitoring apply to all subject visits as per protocol, so not only screening visits? Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. It's every visit, and usually within 24 hours we've evaluated that, and within another 24 hours contacted the rater to make sure that everything is okay. Gishe, do you want to say anything about that?
There's a concept here that sometimes is hard to cover or hard to explain regarding data monitoring itself. But think about it as a continuum. Think about not only that you're talking about a protocol, or they're talking about a series of visits. We do this across protocols, and that means across sponsors. That means that we are in contact with raters on a weekly basis, and what we are covering is they are not topics that they are protocol related, but they are instrument related. We understand that we are not a university. We are not teaching the raters about their clinical assessment. What we are doing is we are discussing how to use the instrument the right way. So the answer is yes. We are covering all the visits, and we're continually talking to raters. We are trying to avoid rater drift, so that doesn't mean that it's only for one sponsor. We talk for raters in different occasions for different sponsors, and it doesn't make any difference. We are just covering issues. Like if it's a schizophrenia study, we are talking what we're talking PANS. If it's a MDD study, we are talking MADRS or Hamilton. We are not talking particulars of the protocol itself.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. Any further questions before I think we have to wrap up in just a moment? Questions certainly can be directed to Prophase or to CROnos. My email at CROnos is wcy@cronosccs.com, and I like questions about any aspect of this, even just regular questions about instruments. I'm happy to answer. Dr. DiClemente, Dr. Jovic, would you like to give your email out to folks? Or do you not want any more questions?
I think maybe, Hannah, you can help us distribute emails to the attendee list. Mine is
great.
jovic@prophase.com, but I think it would probably be a good idea, maybe along with some narrative or the recording or the slides, to distribute that along with our emails, and we certainly welcome any questions, because obviously we talked too long and we didn't get a chance to answer any questions or have it be more interactive, so questions are more than welcome.
Okay, great. All right, well, thanks everyone for listening this afternoon, and I hope this has been of use, and we look forward to hearing from you. So thank you very much, and I'm going to sign off now.